In direct response to American tariffs, Beijing implemented a clear retaliation, a 34% tariff on all imports from the United States. The target is strategic: the agricultural states that politically sustained Donald Trump. Products like soybeans, sorghum, and pork were hit hard. In 2024, the U.S. exported approximately $15 billion in agricultural goods to China. More than 60% of that was soybeans. Now, this trade flow faces imminent collapse as the Chinese tariff barrier solidifies. Trump did not back down. On the contrary, he responded aggressively, raising tariffs on Chinese products to 50%, reaching an unprecedented combined rate of 104%, the highest ever recorded in the bilateral relationship between the world's two largest economies. Even so, the Chinese leadership has not closed all doors. Beijing has indicated openness to discussing a new type of trade deal, possibly similar to the framework of Trump's first term, but American demands remain stalled in a deadlock. Less than 24 hours after Washington's announcement, Asian markets collapsed. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index plummeted more than 13%, the biggest loss in nearly 30 years. The Shanghai Index followed suit, dropping 7%, resulting in a $500 billion loss in market value. The impact was not limited to Asia. North American markets also suffered, with Wall Street falling between 10% and 15% in a matter of days. Panic spread quickly. Investors fled to safer alternatives like gold and U.S. Treasury bonds. One analyst was blunt: it's shock therapy that might kill the patient. With tariffs hitting 104%, the U.S. and China have entered the tensest trade confrontation in decades. In just one market session, more than $700 billion evaporated. Meanwhile, Beijing is tightening control over rare earth metals. Could this be the definitive breaking point in the relationship between the two powers? Since the start of the year, Trump has been escalating tensions: 10% tariffs in February, another 10% in March, and a sudden jump to 34% last week. Now, the president threatens to raise them by another 50%, totaling an unprecedented tariff burden of 104%. The impacts are tangible. A $20 toy could cost $40. A $400 iPhone jumps to $800. A $6,000 car could reach $12,000. Trump's justification: to punish Beijing. But the question remains: is this a strategic move or the trigger for a global collapse? China's retaliation didn't stop at tariffs. Beijing announced severe restrictions on rare earth exports, elements essential for modern technology. With control over about 90% of the global supply, China holds the key to materials like dysprosium, terbium, and neodymium, used in electric vehicle batteries, military radars, semiconductors, and night vision. From now on, American companies need a license to access these materials, and obtaining one won't be simple. For many analysts, this is a veiled embargo with the power to directly pressure the U.S. tech and defense sectors. China's counterattack was precise and deeply strategic. The U.S. and China are now locked in a dangerous game. Who will blink first? But this isn't an ordinary dispute. The entire global economy is being dragged into the battlefield as increasingly high tariffs edge closer to a disguised trade embargo. The central question remains: what is the White House's real goal? Is it to boost revenue, force domestic reindustrialization, or simply use economic pressure as a geopolitical bargaining tool? In response, Beijing accuses Washington of economic abuse and violating international trade principles. Tensions are escalating. The two powers maintain rigid stances, but what was once a stalemate now looks like an expanding geopolitical abyss. The power of a single sentence: Trump and the collapse of trillions. Don't look away. If a single sentence can wipe out $10 trillion in market value, we need to understand exactly what was said and why. At the height of global turbulence, Trump stepped into the Oval Office and declared there are no plans to pause the tariffs. That was enough. The message was received as a direct threat to markets. In just 1 week, $10 trillion vanished from global exchanges. Analysts describe the episode as a financial tsunami that swept away global confidence overnight. And the most alarming part, it didn't come from a law or a natural event, but from a single sentence spoken on camera. In the same press conference, when markets were desperate for moderation, Trump did the exact opposite. He heightened the tension. First, he signaled that the tariffs could become permanent. Then he dropped an unexpected line: "We need open borders." A statement that directly contradicts his traditional anti-immigration rhetoric. Two contradictory messages in the same speech. The result was immediate: widespread confusion. The media was stunned, markets froze, and even members of his own administration showed bewilderment. Next, Trump turned his attention to the Middle East and shocked the world. He suggested that the United States would take control of the Gaza Strip and even proposed relocating Palestinians to other countries. The reaction was instant. Comparisons to historical episodes of forced migration surfaced quickly, reigniting debates about humanitarian crises. It wasn't just about human rights. The statement was seen as a direct blow to the already fragile U.S. position on the international stage. When addressing the economy, Trump chose an unusual word as the centerpiece of his narrative: groceries. According to him, food prices, interest rates, and energy costs were falling. He claimed, "We have groceries," that food was getting cheaper, and even cited a 79% drop in egg prices. But the data tells a different story. Consumer reports show that the cost of living remains high, especially for the middle class. So why insist on this word? Because groceries isn't just a statistic, it's emotion. It's a metaphor for everyday life, the basic struggle for dignity, a symbol that resonates even when the numbers contradict it. In another controversial claim, Trump stated that the U.S. can't sell cars to Europe, but the data says otherwise. Companies like Tesla, Ford, and GM export tens of thousands of vehicles to the European bloc every year. The factual distortion is just the surface. The real impact lies at the industry's base. American factories are cutting production, and thousands of workers have already lost their jobs. The tariffs, meant to protect, are hurting the very people who needed protection most: American workers. In immediate response to Trump's statements, the European Union announced a retaliatory 25% tariff on American products. Giants like Apple reacted quickly, seeking alternatives, including shifting production to countries like India. The reason is clear. According to Fortune, manufacturing an iPhone entirely in the U.S. could raise its cost to as much as $30,000, a price out of reach for most Americans. Made in the USA sounds good on the campaign trail, but in practice, it hits consumers' wallets directly. Meanwhile, China, despite being a rival, seizes the opportunity. With the U.S. focused on protectionism, Beijing strengthens deals with the EU and developing nations. The result? A new trade order is emerging, and it no longer revolves around America. The world reacts. Germany, Canada, and Mexico strike back. Is the world drifting away from the United States? In March 2025, after new unilateral tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, strategic partners like Germany, Canada, and Mexico reacted harshly. The American measure, which added a 25% tariff on imported vehicles and auto parts, was justified as protection for domestic industry. But for many allies, it sounded like a direct provocation. The impact was immediate. According to the Wall Street Journal, car prices in the U.S. are expected to rise between 10% and 15%. There was no transition plan, no phased implementation, just an abrupt decision that shook the global market. Germany's response was swift and forceful. While American consumers were still digesting the tariff impact, Berlin likened the measure to a diplomatic expulsion. Chancellor Olaf Scholz was blunt. Trump is creating losers. This policy is wrong and won't produce winners. The criticism was echoed by the German auto industry, which relies heavily on the U.S. market. About 30% of its vehicle exports go to the U.S. Carmakers like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes weren't worried about a stronger U.S., but rather the collapse of global supply chains. The VDA, Germany's industrial association, warned, if the escalation continues, thousands of jobs are at risk. Germany's message was clear: no one wins a trade war. The U.S.-Canada relationship took an unprecedented hit in 2025 after imposing 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, except oil and gas. Trump made a controversial statement. He suggested Canada become the 51st state of America and even referred to Trudeau as Governor Trudeau. The response was swift and firm. Then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau denounced the attempt to interfere in national sovereignty, while his successor, Mark Carney, called it a direct attack on the country's natural resources. But Canada didn't stop at words. The government encouraged boycotts of American products, bolstered local production and culture, and saw an unprecedented wave of modern nationalism emerge, unseen in decades. The European response was more than symbolic. It was strategic. The European Union, led by Germany, took a clear step to bypass the United States and strengthen ties with Canada. Chancellor Olaf Scholz publicly named Canada the official partner of the 2025 Hanover Industrial Fair, Europe's largest trade event. At the same time, the EU reactivated the CETA agreement, creating a direct trade bridge with Ottawa, independent of American influence. The message was clear. While the U.S. builds barriers, Europe seeks alliances, and this time, without Washington at the center. Mexico, tactical silence and selective response. Unlike Canada, Mexico adopted a silent stance, but one surgically calculated. After the U.S. imposed 25% tariffs in March 2025, President Claudia Sheinbaum responded cautiously. "We will respond selectively at the right time." She called the American justification defamatory and baseless. And with an annual trade volume of $800 billion between the two countries, Mexico chose not to fuel the conflict. But silence wasn't a sign of weakness. When it deemed necessary, Mexico struck back with precision and at the right moment. As the United States adopts a more isolationist stance, historical partners are seeking new routes, economic, diplomatic, and commercial. The rhetoric of global leadership persists, but the signs of distancing are clear. The question then is no longer, who stands with America? It's now, is the world still willing to listen? A recent journalistic investigation shed light on a little-known aspect of U.S. trade policy under the Trump administration, the method used to calculate tariffs. According to the report, the formula involves dividing the U.S. trade deficit with a given country by the total value of imports from that same country. The result is then converted into a percentage and used as the basis for setting the tariff level. Despite its mathematical simplicity, experts warn that this criterion fails to account for structural factors in international trade, such as value chains, bilateral agreements, or the actual level of protection practiced by each country. Still, this approach underpinned decisions that directly impacted the global economy. Applying this formula to China, the U.S. trade deficit, estimated at $295.4 billion, is divided by the total American imports from China, which amount to about $438.9 billion. This yields an approximate rate of 67.3%. That number is then used as a reference to set the applied tariff percentage. However, analysts note that this calculation doesn't necessarily reflect China's tariff policy or the complexity of bilateral trade exchanges. The same criterion was apparently used for countries like Japan and European Union members, raising questions about the accuracy and effectiveness of this approach in the context of international trade relations. The application of this simplified formula led to the creation of tariffs that, in many cases, don't reflect the commercial reality between the United States and its partners. Countries like Vietnam and Cambodia, for example, were cited with high rates, even though they don't impose steep tariffs on American products. This approach has created distorted perceptions. The public might believe these countries impose severe barriers, when the data suggests otherwise. In some cases, nations with which the U.S. maintains a trade surplus were also targeted with tariffs, raising questions about the logic and fairness of the adopted policy. Analysts warn that these inconsistencies could undermine the credibility and effectiveness of U.S. trade policy on the global stage. The adoption of a simplified tariff formula has brought complex and often destabilizing consequences. While countries with genuinely high tariffs remained untouched, others with balanced trade relationships were penalized. This has sparked questions about the accuracy and strategic direction of the tariff policy. Analysts suggest that the side effects of this approach fall directly on the American economy. Despite the official rhetoric promising a manufacturing revival, reality has been marked by uncertainty. Companies are struggling to plan their supply chains and absorb rising costs. The stock market reacts with volatility, and consumers are already feeling the impact of widespread price hikes. The scenario, according to experts, is one of instability, both for the domestic economic environment and for the U.S.'s global position. In March 2025, China suspended all imports of LNG from the U.S., a market worth $2.4 billion annually. The move, seen as retaliation to American tariffs, caught the energy sector off guard. The U.S., the world's top LNG exporter in 2024, suddenly lost its second-largest buyer. Beijing responded by redirecting shipments to Europe, where demand for alternatives to Russian gas remains high. With this, China avoided tariffs and further strengthened its influence in one of the world's most strategic energy markets. With the U.S. out of the game, Europe quickly became the preferred destination for Chinese LNG. Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy adjusted their policies to take advantage of cheaper Asian gas. The European Union accelerated the construction of storage infrastructure and port expansions to manage this new energy flow. After the Russia-Ukraine crisis, energy demand on the continent is urgent. The result? While LNG revenue flows to Europe, the U.S. loses market share and strategic influence in the region. Amid the U.S. energy crisis, Australia secured a strategic $1.5 billion contract with China Resources Gas. The deal, starting in 2027, provides for the supply of 600,000 tons of LNG per year. Australian gas is not only 20% cheaper than American gas, but also takes 10 days less to reach China due to geographic proximity. This contract, beyond being a commercial success, also signals a geopolitical shift. Australia, a traditional U.S. ally, is establishing itself as China's primary energy supplier. With a population of 1.44 billion and the world's second-largest economy, China has enormous energy demands, and LNG has become central to its energy strategy. After U.S. tariffs in 2019, Beijing began diversifying its LNG sources. In 2024, American gas accounted for just 5.4% of its imports, a significant drop from the previous 20%. To ensure greater energy autonomy, China signed long-term deals with countries like Qatar, Russia, and Central Asia. It also invested in the East Asia Pipeline, set to begin operations in 2027, and strengthened its partnership with Australia, focusing on LNG and essential minerals. Before China suspended imports, the U.S. exported about 400,000 tons of LNG to the country annually, generating $2.4 billion. With the suspension, U.S. export terminals were left saturated with unsold stocks. Contracts were canceled, and transportation costs soared. Australia, which had previously lagged behind the U.S. in the LNG market, seized the opportunity to overtake the United States and become the top supplier to China and other Asian markets. This multi-billion-dollar shock put the U.S. LNG industry at risk of restructuring, while the global energy market enters a new phase where price and geopolitical strategy become decisive factors. The suspension of U.S. LNG imports by China, combined with the cancellation of billion-dollar contracts, had a profound impact on the global energy market. China's response was strategic. It quickly redirected LNG shipments to Europe, where the need for alternatives to Russian gas remains high. By doing so, Beijing not only dodged U.S. tariffs, but also reinforced its influence in a critical market, establishing a new global energy order, where geopolitics becomes a determining factor. The impact of this reconfiguration will be global, with economic and political consequences that will shape the future of the world economy. The question remains, what will be the next move, and who will emerge victorious in the race for economic and energy supremacy? What's your opinion on this shift in the global order? How do you think the U.S. can respond to this new landscape of alliances and energy strategies? Leave your analysis in the comments below. We want to hear what you think. If this kind of geopolitical analysis helps you better understand the world's movements, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It strengthens the continuity of this independent work. See you in the next episode.